Yes, thanks. And it's just my part to hand over to Miriam, our new member in the Austria chapter, who will be the moderator today. Warm welcome, Miriam. You can start. It's yours.
Thank you very much. Just a second. I will just turn on the camera in a minute. Yeah, good morning from the Austria chapter. Very warm welcome. It was nice to hear the chapter before. Very interesting thoughts about Koshu Ufu I saw from Mr. Shimura, adaptability and prosperity. Very nice to hear that one. But today we are not alone in this Austria chapter session. We have thank you too. We have very distinguished guests with us, and before starting with the session, I will just make sure that we have all on deck here that will be discussing and presenting with us. I see Mr. Ian Hughes, and make you as a co-host too. You are it already. And we have, in addition, Mr. Nadav Eyal. I will have a look. I don't see him yet. Mrs. Alyssa Jade McDonald-Bertel. I don't see yet too. So maybe we just start with the introduction, and then hopefully they join in a second because they are quite busy, even in these times. I will explain in a minute why. So let's take the chance to just present what we are doing today, and I will share with you my screen for a second. So good morning again. Can you see my screen right now?
Yes, we can, Miriam.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. Warm welcome from the Austrian chapter, as Ernst von Kimakowitz just said, and also Markus Glatz-Schmalegger said, the Austrian chapter lead. So what did we think of for the session today? We thought of the chapter this year shall tackle solutions, but what is the essence of finding solutions? Why do we need to find solutions? And we thought, okay, we currently live in a kind of revolt era, and that is the essence why we need to find solutions. And that is why we have a diverse variety of speakers today that you will meet in a second. But beforehand, what you can do is just follow us on LinkedIn also, because the main idea of course, of the Humanistic Management Network is networking, and you join probably also because of that reason to globally connect with each other. And if you want to do so, you can just here take your smartphone and get in to LinkedIn with this barcode, and then you're in the whole group of Humanistic Management Networkers, and can interconnect with the people who are participating in that very conference. Yeah, but also I just see, there is Alyssa Jade McDonald-Bertel. Good morning, good to see you here. Maybe Marcus, you can in the background then just make them to co-hosts once they join the speakers. That would be great. Yeah, and before introducing our distinguished speakers, thank you very much to the people who made this even possible. And that's at first to name the person who made the network possible. That's Ernst von Kimakowitz, who you see also in the spotlight waving here. And also Blandina Baranes, who's member of the network here, who just recently joined to the time that I joined too in the Austrian chapter. And she even was very active and invited Nada Vejal to us. Thank you very much, Dina. And of course, Markus Glatz-Schmalegger, our Austrian chapter lead, he not only started the chapter last year, but in addition, invited Alyssa Jade McDonald-Bertel and also Ian Hughes, and someone who wants to give us some welcome words virtually through me right now. That's Brian O'Gallagher, the director of the Marai Center of Research. And with us is also Ian Hughes, also from the center that we will then present to you in a second. So I just look into the round whether all the speakers are right now here. I see Alyssa, I see Ian Hughes. I don't see yet, but maybe we start then with the two of you, and Nada Vejal will join them in a second. Okay, so let's just start this session. Yeah, who do we have here right now with us? The first that I mentioned before here is the man who was mentioned here in the second row, Ian Hughes. Ian Hughes is really an interesting person who's kind of like a boundary spanner, I would say, between different things like science, economy, social life. He's from Ireland, and he has an educational background in not only atom physics, which is interesting enough, but also in psychology. And this combination is really, crucial. And he's not only worked with the world's largest nuclear fusion machine, so interesting here in the drone, but also established a center of creative technologies that brings art and technology together. He co-founded a program that brings science and journalism together to make it more accessible for the public. He's also a Silver Award winner of Ireland's Blog Award. Very cool. And currently an advisor in science, technology and innovation policy at the Marai, a Center of Research for Energy, Climate and Marine in Ireland. Not only that, he also works for the government and also for the OECD as consultant. So yeah, he is a broad area of interests, and the broad area of interest is related to, on the one hand, exploring how research in science can benefit the economy and our social society. And that has different angles. On the one hand, he cares about deep institutional innovations. So he goes really into the deep dive. Why is it so hard to change the things we have today? And he also cares about the role of language in these areas by looking at metaphors. What are our metaphors that we use today, the narratives that we use today, and how do they shape our reality? And not even that, he also cares about dangerous personality traits. Very cool one, I think, here. And we could continue endlessly, but that we don't have the time for. So I would say a very warm welcome to you, Ian Hughes, and maybe you could just turn on your microphone to say a hello into the group here.
Thank you very much, Miriam. And thanks to all the organizers for the invite. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much. We do so too. Let's say we continue with another very, very distinguished guest here. This is Alyssa Jade McDonald-Bertel. We are very honored to have you here in the group because Alyssa Jade McDonald is a super dynamic, a social entrepreneur living in Germany, coming from originally Papua New Guinea, and she is not only a third generation farmer, which is interesting enough, but she now lives in Germany and she has a background in journalism on the one hand, and in environmental science on the other hand. And interestingly enough, she focuses on evidence-based sustainable businesses, especially in the small and mid-size sector, and has a great passion for agricultural science. Yeah, and that would be very, very interesting already, but not to stay there. She spent 10 years, if I researched it correctly, in the corporate area. So for 10 years, she was at Deutsche Telekom, the head of international communications. Cool as that is, but then she said, I will follow my passion. And then she founded a Bliss company and created there an award-winning tree-to-bar chocolate. One of the rarest one there at the time in terms of sustainability. And that was even also not the end for her. She said then, okay, I want to really make a huge impact and train cacao farming in a sustainable way. As a cacao academy where she trains farmers and makes the food production there just more sustainable. And the relation here to science is also super interesting. If I saw it correctly, you're doing a PhD right now in that area, so we might see something from you in the next time. And that's also not to stop here, because what she does in addition is that she advises the European Commission on sustainable finance, economic innovation, partnerships for green and social economy, and she is board member in several areas. I was really impressed to read that. In SIGA, for example, that is a global research partnership for food security. Cool topic here, really. In BMW, which is the German Federation of Sustainable Economy, also super interesting. And I also read Greenpeace Pacific GA. So also here, it's super interesting to read that. We could also continue endlessly, but we will stop here and say a very, very warm welcome to you, Alessa Jade McDonald-Bertel. And I invite you also to jump in with your voice to say hello to our audience here.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for the greetings. Lovely to see you here as well, Ian. And I just am delighted to join the 9th International Humanistic Management Conference today. I really love what Ernst and the team have put together over these years. And it's always a delight to pop in and see where is the thinking at the moment about some of the biggest issues that we're facing these days. So you're absolutely the highlight of my week. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, too. And I would just go the round and see again if Nadav Eyal has joined us.
Miriam?
Yeah.
I wrote you a note in the chat. Nadav Eyal is trying to get in. He seems to have some problems with the ticket, but he received all informations a second time, so should be there. So,
okay, then maybe we wait for a second.
Sorry if I jump in here. Maybe you can just email him directly the links to this room. Then he doesn't have to go through the whole registration process, which should have been done by now.
Okay, super. Yeah. Thanks, Ernst. Will you do that?
I don't have his email. Sorry, you have to handle this.
Okay.
I can't.
Thank you.
So then in the meantime, while Markus Glatz-Schmalegger is organizing that, we will have a short look at some slides that we wanted to show later on, which are the slides for the later sessions of today and tomorrow. So we have a very distinguished group here right now. And also the sessions later on will be very interesting ones. So maybe if you haven't had the chance to look at the program already, you will have the chance to look at it while Nadav Eyal is joining here, and that's on that slide. And maybe just to highlight here our Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus this afternoon, which is super interesting. And what do we have in addition? Here the India chapter, Humanistic Solutions for Society, super cool. Heartful Entrepreneurship, I'm really looking forward to that one. And the Imperative of Culture and Values, that's from Nigeria. Really a hot topic for me, values and culture. Yeah, tomorrow the China chapter will come with Humanistic Leadership for Sustainability. And yeah, the coffee break will be done by the FH Burgenland. That is Markus Glatz-Schmalhegger, who hides behind here. And also, I forgot, Marai will also do the coffee break after our session here. Then the UK chapter will do Humanizing Business School curricula. And in the afternoon, we will have an OECD session, also very, very interesting. Light for the World will give us a break in the afternoon. And then we will have the Africa chapter on leadership practices for prosperity. Also, I guess a very distinguished program. And here, once again, once you want to take the chance to come in via the barcode to our group on LinkedIn, just use the chance right now. And I see Markus Glatz-Schmalhegger
yes, Miriam,
has the camera on. Yeah.
Miriam,
Yeah.
Nadav Eyal is on board, so you can start.
Cool.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, brilliant. So with the camera on already, because I don't see you, Nadav Eyal, yet. I think he's joining right now. He's
just made him co-host, so now things should be working.
Yeah,
Nadav, if you receive the co-host status, you can make some noise or wave or let us know, please.
Yes, I did. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, very warm welcome to you, Nadav Eyal.
Thank you.
So we just made a short introduction of Alyssa Jade McDonald-Battle, Ian Hughes, and right now we are very honored to have you on board here of that distinguished group. Yeah, who is Nadav Eyal? I guess many of you know him, but nonetheless, it's nice to hear who that person is, the third person in the group. And Nadav Eyal is one of Israel's leading journalists. We are very honored about that here. And yeah, some people in the last years even said he's one of the most influential journalists in Israel and beyond. Yeah, what makes him so influential? Not only an interesting background, educational-wise, in global politics and law, and a really, really steep career. So to come until now, what he does now is a senior columnist at Yediot Aharon. I hope I spell it correctly, newspaper. And this is, okay, I think, yes, it was like that. And that's one of Israel's most circulated newspaper for those who haven't heard about it already. And he's also the winner of the Sokolov Prize, Israel's most important journalism award. Super interesting here. And not only to say that, not only in the classic media he's present, but also in the new media and the social media, where he has a huge followership. And I'm sure that some people will search you on social media afterwards. And yeah, he's not only that influential journalist, but also a chairman of the Israeli movement of freedom of information. Which I found very interesting here to say. And Yeah, about 2 decades, if I researched it correctly, you were investigating intensively in Middle Eastern and international politics. And not only from the books, but also from a very intense practice research. He just wrote a bestseller, The REVOLT, which is this book here in the English version. And there he says, there's a global uprising against globalization. Globalization helps us in some ways to have a better state of living for the many, but also we have seeds of exploitation and threats to local identities. And if we don't do anything here, we risk a collapse, and that we don't want. And without further saying, I would very warm welcome you as well here in the group, Mr. Nadav Eyal, and maybe you also say a hello to our round here.
Hi, being here and participating to be with other people like Ernest Hughes and Elizabeth Jones, and I'm very happy to participate.
Thank you so much too. Yeah, and that is now, time has progressed fast. So that is why we will start right away with our discussion. We will have 3 parts. The first part will be that our distinguished speakers present their approaches to revolts and solutions. And then afterwards, the 3 will be discussing with each other. And in the end, you will have the chance to raise the question. What means you will raise your questions already right now, directly in the chat. And Markus Glatz-Schmalegger will write it to me, so that then after the discussion round between the 3, we will have the chance to answer your questions that you put into the chat. Yeah, and without further saying, I would invite you, Mr. Eyal, to give us an insight in your perspective, because you have intensively researched about the revolt against globalization from very different angles, very different examples. So you have a broad and an in-depth view of why we have a revolt, why the era of responsibility is over, and what we can do about that. Yeah, the stage is yours, Mr. Eyal. I'm highly looking forward to your perspective on that topic.
Thank you. Miriam, can you remind me how many minutes do I have for this presentation?
It's 10 minutes, yeah.
Okay,
and,
that's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure. Okay. Yeah. So thank you very much for joining. The world has seen an enormous change since 1945, which basically improved the human condition immensely. We have seen this in various points of data, and we have seen this in our lives, the lives of our parents and sometimes of our grandparents, child mortality, education, everywhere, longevity, everywhere you look at, struggling against infectious diseases, vaccination. Every point of the human condition has at least materialistically improved since 1945. Now, one of the things that we've been focused at for many years is the distinction between East and West. So if we would have spoken, or we would have thought about the history of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, we would have usually focused mainly about the confrontation between the USSR and the United States, between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. And that was the main focus of our political conversation. Looking back, I'm not sure that this view of a dichotomic world is the right way to approach our history. And I would rather talk about what I label an age of responsibility, like Miriam, you have mentioned before. I think that both superpowers were focused on a rational way to tackle the challenges of the modern world. And both superpowers were trying to rationally improve the material life of their citizens and the relative blocks around them. Now, of course, the USSR was a totalitarian, oppressive state, and it also oppressed the nations around it. But basically, in cases, the values of were really the structure on which everything was based on. And I think that to a large extent, we are enjoying the fruits of that age of responsibility. But globalization was, the way that we look at globalization today, is the product not of the two superpowers, but the one that survived. And that's the United States. So it was envisioned as a political program after 1945 and through the Bretton Woods agreements, in order to present a world in which there will be a constant flow and a relative free flow of capital, of merchandise, of industry, a world in which the engine is supply and demand, and the main rule is the rule of efficiency. So this is the basic logics on which that engine should work on. Not really talking about local communities, talking about regional identities, or about the way that basically small sections in our societies, smaller and smaller sections of our societies, way into our families will survive in this, but generally speaking about growth, speaking about what we label the Washington Consensus. And to an extent it worked. So it brought a wave of prosperity to the West, and after the Eastern Bloc collapsed, it brought another wave of prosperity to the Eastern Bloc. And if you look at, the end of 1990s, the beginning of 2000s, it's Francis Fukuyama with his End of History and the Last Man, and history is over, liberal democracy has won, and everything's just dandy. And what I mark as the end of responsibility is September 11. I don't do so because I think September 11 as of itself ended the era of responsibility. I'm just using that date because it's important. It signifies that democracy has not won. Liberalism or capitalist liberalism, cultural globalization is not the queen, the empress of the world. It's not so. And I'm using it the same way that historians are using 476 to mark the fall of Rome. So Rome has fallen probably before that or after that, but in 476 there was this head of the tribe that entered Rome, and he declared himself king. And historians said, well, in Rome there were other leaders of tribes that declared themselves Caesars, but this was the first time that they used the term king. And they said, oh, kingship and Rome, the Republic and the Empire, they don't go together. They didn't want to use that. So they marked 476. But if you had lived in Rome in 476, nobody would walk out and say, oh, Rome has fallen. It's at the beginning of the Middle Ages. They have just begun. So it's only retrospectively that we could mark that. And the same way I'm marking retrospectively 9/11. In which agents of fundamentalism initiated the most deadly terror attack in history, which was also televised and hardwired into our consciousness through mass media. And I can mention here what Baudrillard wrote about it. I duly recommend it. The way that the media sort of, although I'm a journalist, enhances terror in the way that it just operates, not with malice. And what we have seen is that this era of globalization, though improving and pulling a billion people, more than a billion people, out of lives of poverty, mostly in East and Southeast Asia, has also put the seeds, sowed the seeds of its own resistance. It has threatened local communities and identities everywhere. It has basically spread only one notion of a cultural integration. And it was not sustainable, and it is not sustainable. It is not sustainable to our environment, as we know, because of climate change. It is not sustainable to sections of our societies that feel immensely threatened. It's not sustainable because as Thomas Friedman wrote in his last book, explained that at length, the way that our technological change is just pushing forward so quickly, and our societies are not adapting as quickly because we're just humans, we're not apps, and it's very difficult for us to adapt as quickly as we want. And it's not sustainable because the way that our structures were built after 1945 were not post-colonialist, but in a sense were the transition of colonialism into a world structure. So if we look at the UN Security Council, it's preposterous that it does not have any members from South and Central America. It's preposterous that the Security Council, and I mean the constant members of the Security Council, you know, the 5, there is no person that is black there, either from Africa or from other places for that matter, but basically from Africa, it's not represented at all. So that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable that we have a tax regime that basically says that if you're middle class, you pay your taxes. If you're rich, you pay some taxes. And if you're uber rich, you don't pay taxes at all. And if you're a corporation, you can somehow not pay taxes anywhere in the world. Now, when I wrote the book, and I wrote that was before Joe Biden. It was before the G7 said, we're going to change that. And they started to change that. Because I think that we understand that even to maintain globalization within the framework of liberal capitalism, we need to have these reforms. So if I would be so dead set on having the same system that we have today and enjoying, you know, the gaps within Western societies between rich and poor, if I would be, you know, in a capitalist position, I would be the leader of a big corporation, I would want these reforms, because it's either these reforms or the revolt taking complete control. Now, what I write in the book about the revolt is that the revolt is mainly a sentiment. It's a political sentiment. And the sentiment is as such. People are revolting because they think that our structures are corrupt, hollow, incompatible to the challenges of our world. And they are revolting. It's not all of the people. It's not the majority of the people. But sometimes it's the sections of society that make the decisions. Maybe it's because the way of the electoral system is built in the United States. So it happened to be in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and in all these blue states that turned red in 2016. And I was in these places.
Interrupt you too much. Maybe we hear 1-2 sentences from you, and then we jump to the next speaker.
Okay. And I think that in the end, when we look at this, we need to remember that we can harness the power of the revolt, and we can harness it into a real change, into progressive change. And if we won't do that, the revolt will turn into a full-scale uprising against progress and against the values of enlightenment. And actually, it has already begun.
Thank you very much. What a statement in the end. We will harness the revolt for progressive change. Thank you so much, Mr. Eyal. Yeah, would welcome you. The next step, Mr. Ian Hughes, to bring in your in-depth perspective of the institutional innovation, the metaphors, the disordered minds of what you think characterizes the crisis currently what is behind, and what could be ways to move it forward into progressive change, as Nadav Eyal just said a minute ago.
Thank you very much, Miriam. And also just to start by thanking Nadav for the book. I think it's changed my thinking in some ways about the position that we're in, especially this idea of revolt. And I think streams of revolt is something maybe we can talk about later. I think maybe there's a destructive stream of revolt and there may be a constructive stream of revolt. And it would be interesting to talk about that as we go along, maybe. I'm going to spend the few minutes I have talking about a project that I'm working on along with Marcus. Ernst is involved as well, and with colleagues here in Ireland. And also with the OECD, William Hines, who's talking tomorrow, is also one of our colleagues on this project. And it's called Deep Institutional Innovation for Sustainability and Human Development. So there's a number of basic premises behind this project, which I think we have an opportunity here. It's a really interesting one to test these ideas, sort of with a global audience, because we tend to think in terms of Western European thinking, but to have a global audience that can think about these ideas too is a real opportunity here. So the first starting point is what a phrase Joe Biden used in his inaugural address when he said that we're in an era of cascading crises. So it's not just climate change. Nadav has mentioned the disruptive technology and the huge disruptions that technology is happening. We're also living at a time of huge ecological crisis in terms of species extinction and in terms of deforestation, the pollution of our oceans and soils and so forth. We're also at a time of political and geopolitical crisis. There are huge disparities in wealth and income inequality that are disrupting social stability. Also the rising tensions between US and China, just to mention a few. So we're facing an era of cascading crises all at the same time. Part of the DIAS project, the second thing is to posit that at this moment of these cascading crises, we are also at a time of failing social institutions. So there are a range of social institutions that we talk about: politics, economics, religion, gender, technology, education, and even in terms of arts and humanities, the role that they play at this moment. But virtually all of these social institutions in one way or another are failing. And I think that's another way to look at, from my perspective, to look at what Nadav has been writing about, that we talk about globalization and the failure of globalization, but to my mind, that is a failure of multiple social institutions, simultaneous failure of multiple social institutions. And they're failing in two respects. On one side, they're contributing to the crises, the multiple crises that we're facing. And on the other side, in their current form, they're incapable of resolving those crises. So our contention then is that we need to reimagine from the ground up all of these fundamental social institutions. And again, going back to Nadav's idea about failure of globalization, I think this can also be thought of as a failure of the norms and values and rules that govern all of these social institutions. It's we think of this almost as in terms of a landscape of social values, landscape of rules and norms. And this landscape, which could be called industrial modernity or post-modernity, whatever we like to call it, this landscape is actually no longer fit for purpose. And in fact, one of the advantages of thinking of all of these social institutions simultaneously is that we can begin to see the values and rules that are common across all of them, whether it's religion, whether it's economics, whether it's gender, politics, and so forth. And we begin to see some of those values, some of those rules, things like, that man, and it usually is man, has a right to dominion over nature, that meritocracy is a good thing, even given the difficulties in terms of having any true meritocracy. Meritocracy maybe just exacerbates inequality, destructive competition, the idea of the myth of redemptive violence, that we can, violence will bring us to a better place eventually. So all of these things, I think, in terms of the meta rules and values that sort of overarch across all of these social institutions and have done for a very long time, I think are some of the things that we need to reimagine. So I think one of the other aspects that we concentrate on in this framing of deep institutional innovation is the need for containment of toxicity. So at a moment like the present, when there's so much failure, so much anger and revolt, that is a natural consequence, we would argue, of the failures of all of these social institutions and people being caught in multiple ways in these failures. This is an absolute godsend for particular types of individuals who would like to take advantage of that mayhem in order to further their own power and their own wealth. And we call this traumatizing narcissism. You could call this the age of the traumatizing narcissist. But when you look at politics and Trump and Putin and Modi and Xi and so forth, when you look at economics, individual as a profit maximizer, when you look at religion, going back a very long time, humanity as evil, original sin, man's domination of women and nature. When you look at gender and the inherent sort of structural violence that is implied in gender, and again, technology, and we can talk about this maybe later, as this is part of what the conference is about. The idea that destructive creation or creative destruction, Nadav has already mentioned it, that technology will come out in the end, and the consequences in terms of local identities, local communities, and so forth can be an externality. So, so those are I think in each of these cases, I think the dominant paradigm across so many of these social institutions makes it very difficult to do what the Humanistic Management Network is founded upon, which is an image of ourselves, an image of human nature that is actually based on care and love and cooperation. So that even getting from the starting block of reimagining these social institutions and our society in terms of an image of humanity that is more based on care than it is based on selfishness and violence is actually very difficult because of the inherent structure of violence that's embedded in all of these social institutions. I think I'm running short of time. I would only mention in closing, so a paper that we've done with William Hines from OECD. Well, the OECD have done a paper called Beyond Growth, which looks specifically at economics and some of the economic failures about economic wealth inequality, stagnation of decline of living standards, insecure work, divergence between North and South, which is beginning, and also divergence within countries. And looking at the structural flaws within the global economy that are partly responsible for this, the growth of financial capitalism, monopoly power of corporations, focus on GDP, we could go on. And then the necessary implications and interventions that are needed to put these right. And they are absolutely fundamentally structural interventions that are needed. And I think that makes it difficult in terms of the conference when looking at individual firms and individual actions. How can firms and individuals make a difference in a system that is so inherently structurally flawed? And again, that's maybe something we can bring up in the discussion. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you very much. How can individuals make a difference? Also a great statement in the end right now. Ian Hughes, thank you very much. And without further saying too much, I would highly welcome you again, Alyssa Jade McDonald, for your perspective, your business perspective, social business perspective of what the current crisis is about and what can be tackled and moves towards solutions, sustainable solutions. Thank you very much, Alyssa Jade McDonald.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you. I stand with Nadav and Ian in some concepts here that were discussed regarding the failure of social institutions. And I'll propose for the next minutes to talk about that in the context of food security in a climate challenge. When Ian was talking about the failure of social institutions, it struck me how many of the world's farmers that are producing our wheat, our corn, our rice, our livestock, are living in a food insecure environment themselves. Food insecurity means not the access to affordable and sufficient food. Could you imagine that what you do as a job every day does not even nourish or sustain you in your own life. Isn't that just a little bit off? And it's this aspect, thinking about this, that I think about what Nadal stimulated us with either integrate or revolt. What if the world's farmers suddenly said, you know what, actually, why don't we farm for us and not you? And wouldn't that be a fair question for them to ask? I propose that there are some interesting aspects to think about the world's farmers and food security with three conceptual ideas. One is the role of transdisciplinarity, which really brings up Nadal and Ian's point about the individual. The second thing is about innovation in a simple form. And the third one is about outputs, outcomes as opposed to outputs. Firstly, transdisciplinarity. Let's look at that in food. Both Nadav and Ian talked about the role of the individual in participation. How do we get the small-scale farmer or the livestock herder to have a voice at the table of global agriculture? How were they present in Glasgow? There are ways of coming up with food, land, water systems that take into mind the requests and needs of farmers that are part of the value chain. There are some really interesting methods. One I'd like to give about a concept of a sweet flesh orange potato, which came from South America and was recently introduced to parts of Africa for its interesting aspect of having high volumes of important nutrients that directly addressed a health insecurity in parts of Africa. Secondly, it wonderfully turns into breads and cookies. This potato not only was an easier one to farm, had less toxicity than other potatoes, but lent itself to value chain development, which meant that those involved in the potato farming could not only access a better nutrition for themselves in their household, but maybe even have members of their family, friends, or community participate in that potato's further development so they themselves as a community could gain more out of this crop. Transdisciplinarity in this aspect came to long discussions with varieties of potato genetics to what do you want to eat? What's culturally interesting? How do you celebrate at family parties? How do you celebrate a child's birth? What happens at a wedding? What is interesting to sustain this community? Why is it food insecure? Why is food too expensive? What happens for the food that's produced here and where does it go? And so I propose this idea that farmers are at the table of thinking about genetic varieties which enter their continent. Often we think this is the job of organizations that Nadav and Ian has talked about, global organizations and multinational institutions. No, it's the farmers, because they're the ones doing the work. And if we would like to consider Nadav's point about revolt or integrate, I think these are some concrete examples of what that could mean. Secondly, I'd like to propose that innovation isn't necessarily a drone or a high-tech solution. What if I told you that a goat is potentially one of the most interesting innovations we could see in global food system right now? For example, goats really like to eat diseased leaves and fruits from a cacao tree. Goats also provide milk and meat to a family and to a community. What if I told you that it takes 2 hours a day, laborious labor per hectare of cacao to go around and cut off all the dead branches? If you don't cut off the dead and diseased branches of your cacao tree, you will lose your crop. It will create a disease and you will lose your entire harvest. Therefore, you have to get every diseased piece of leaf off. But you know what it's like when you try to scrape off dirt off your shoe before you come into your house. What happens if you don't properly get it off? You might drag it into your house and dirty your house. It's the same with plant pathology. And in the past, we have done excessive chemicals. We've considered machinery. We've considered child labor, slave labor, migrant labor, all of these solutions to do this very laborious task of getting diseased plant and material out of farms. But there are simpler solutions which lend themselves to abundance and growth in that area. A goat, a simple goat. Goats love these pieces of plants. They love these fruits. They can live happily inside the same farm. I propose that sometimes we are overthinking solutions beyond the innovations that exist inherently in solutions. We underestimate what these solutions can do with their positive knock-on effects Milk and meat, what did I mention before? Are farmers abundant or food insecure? They're food insecure. So why are our solutions not solving some of the big problems that they're brought in to bring with? Brings me to my final point. Why are we output focused and not outcome? Why are we measuring global food security by tons? Why are we not looking about nutritional sufficiency? Why are we not looking at food health? When we look at outcomes and not outputs, we don't measure the value of my cacao farm by how many tons we're producing. We measure it by a system of regenerative agriculture that we've put in, which plants beans at the bottom, maybe has some goats on the side, maybe has chili, maybe has bananas that feed the families, keep the chickens happy. And what we have is one of these sustaining ecosystems. We talk very often at this high level of these integrated systems, and we don't know what it means. I propose to you, it is beans in the ground. It's cacao in the middle. It's bananas on top. It's chilies on the side. It's chickens running around and goats on the edge eating the waste. It's farmer schools inside. It's children learning art and music, connecting to their native languages, and also understanding how they can trade the various crops of their farm at a more enabling way in the future when they grow up. It's not them being sent off to schools and migrant labor doing the work. It's not them being kept out of schools and doing the work. It is this systems approach. And thus that is a contribution I would like to follow up from my colleagues, Nadav and Ian, questioning integrate or revolt. Let us look at food systems as an example on that. And Ian's point about the failure of social systems that bring us together. Indeed, agriculture uses 70% of the world's fresh water. It is one of the major contributors to carbon emissions. And it is the thing that you and I had before we joined this call. It is the coffee in our cup that we all have sitting beside us. Let us look to the reminders of our day as we consider what we're doing in our humanistic management responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, author Alyssa Jade McDonald-Bertel. So super interesting how you already interacted with each other. Let's continue with that part. I'm highly interested in the point we saw right now that we have kind of like a systemic crisis on different levels and integrated levels. You talked, Alyssa Jade McDonald-Bertel, about the farmers and how an integrated view could there be looked at. And Nadav and Ian, you looked at it also from the angles of politics, of technology, and so on. Maybe to just start with you, Nadav, how would an integrated perspective of you three on solutions look like from your view? Maybe you just turn on the mic again.
Yeah,
you were super like to turn it off.
Touched. Yeah, thank you, Mary. I think we all touched on different. I think we all touched on different issues, on different aspects of a common problem, and the problem is that what we have today is not sustainable, and we have to remind this to ourselves all the time. It's either because of the way that small-time farmers are being destroyed by international corporations, thus leading to a less efficient food system, global food system, as Alyssa Jade McDonald just explained. I think very vividly and interestingly. It was really interesting to hear specifically the goat. Here in the Middle East, by the way, goats are a very problematic issue sometimes, specifically to agriculture. But it's interesting how in some places it can serve different means, and of course in the way that that Ian mentioned about how our social institutions are not intertwined with what were the basic ideas on which they were founded on, that are ideas that are basically based on humanistic values. So this is the great change of this is the great miracle of the human race in our history. It's not a linear kind of improvement. You know, we didn't find the fire and then invent the wheel. Now we're on Zoom. It's the mystery and the success of the man-made miracle after the Renaissance. You know, think for yourself, Immanuel Kant's description of this age, and that's everything was based upon, and it has drifted so much away, and I think Ian sort of represented that very well. From these essences, and our social institutions are simply, in that sense, not working. So if you ask me, first of all, what we need to do, Miriam, the answer is that we probably know what we need to do. There are sort of 20 or 30 reforms out there, and everybody knows, including mainstream economists, that we need to do these things in order to have a system that is basically just more sustainable. We know that we need to have better aims, which will be binding, in order to tackle climate change and the biodiversity crisis, which is, by the way, in more sense than one, even more critical right now. For instance, for agriculture, but not only for the existence of all living things. We're seeing a wave of annihilation in our natural world, and we're completely disregarding it, saying, you know, it's going to be somehow it's going to be fine. So we really need to tackle these issues, and we basically know we have a set of reforms there. That's not our problem. Our problem is to have you know, it's like an empire with no soldiers. It's the Roman Empire towards its end. So they know exactly what they needed to do, but they didn't have soldiers. And in our civilization, at least for now, in Western civilization, at least in democracies, soldiers are voters. So it's the voters that win the battles. It's the voters that, because of them, the United States is now more committed to fighting climate change, right? It's because of the voters. So voters, politicians, they change things. And the main problem is that we are simply not able to enlist enough people to some of these causes. And maybe, and I'm really interested in Ian's and Lisa's views about that, making them willing to pay prices, real prices in their daily life for the things that we believe, and most of them do believe too, that matter. And that's, I think, having that narrative, having that story, enlisting people to things that most scientists, experts, people who have dwelled on these subjects know, towards an action. That's a real challenge. That's their real challenge of our time. So if the 20th century was the century about what, the 21st century is the century about how are we going to do all this? And I think we're struggling with this. So we need a narrative, and people enlist themselves to narratives, not to data. The narrative is based on sentiment. Politics is based on sentiment, and I think that the quote opening my book is by Frederick Douglass. It says, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." So one of the things that I think that happened to people in urban kind of academic, progressive elites is that they sequestered themselves in the city centers, and they had a great life, and they sort of reimagined themselves that the status quo is just great, and that's the way to go. They sort of forgot that in order to have progress just maintain itself, not even, you know, just change society altogether, you need to continue on with changing with society. And Frederick Douglass, which was of course a freed slave, and he gave that speech about slavery. He said to people, you know, people that want change without struggle, it's like people who want to take out the crops without sowing the fields first. And I think we understand that this is how we are today. So first of all, we need to work our way very quickly. And secondly, we cannot be shy about the things that need changing. So as we set the bar higher and higher, you know, the center of politics will need to align itself with these kinds of reforms. So we see the change that Greta Thunberg has brought with her, and it's good to acknowledge it. It's because she set a higher bar than mainstream green politics did at the time. She just set a higher bar. Now, I'm not agreeing with everything there. I don't. That's the truth. But I think that bar is really important, and it's really resetting the value. And I'll really be interested to hear from Elisa and Ian about their viewpoints about how we can actually do that and enlist people into a political will, which I think sometimes is not there, to be frank.
Thank you very much, Knut. Yeah. So, Ian, what do you say about it? How can we increase the political will, and how can we also raise up the bar in order, to continuously change the society on all levels, on the political level, but also on the level of the farmers and on the level of the businesses? And why is it so hard? How can we tackle it?
There's a lot of thoughts going through my mind now. So I'd like to start by being devil's advocate for Nadav a little. And when you say that the 21st century is the century of how, I think 21st century is maybe for the first time in our history, maybe the most critical time in our history, the century of what? What are we? Yeah. Are we profit maximizers? Are we born with original sin? Are we needing constraint in our nature needs constraint in order to keep the worst away from us? You know, are we the type of species that wants to promote basically disordered minds in power over us, to have the power to shape our social institutions and so forth? So I think the moment that we're facing is really a reckoning about our own nature. And can we reimagine our social institutions and our society on the basis of a different view of ourselves? I would also say, I agree with you absolutely, what we have is not sustainable. But I think there's very different views on what needs to be done as a result of that. So one of them, I think we're all agreed we're in an age of revolt. But I think there's different views on how seriously to take that revolt. One view is that reform is what's needed. I think I would take the view that reform isn't going to be enough. I think we need transformation. And I think before I would have started on this project, I would have thought that, you know, the phrase "this civilization is finished" would be, you know, hyperbole. But if you think of civilization as the rules that underpin these various, you know, our economics and our education and so forth, I think it's not too hyperbolic to think that our civilization is finished. I think we've been at moments like this before. And I think the danger, as you were saying about we're living in an age of revolt, I think the danger of going with a reform agenda rather than a transformation agenda is that we are in the same position that we were and other societies have been multiple times. So if you think of China, you think of Soviet Union and so forth. And that's a moment where the myth of redemptive violence breaks through. That we're in a moment where the Pentagon, I learned this phrase this week, the Pentagon used the phrase, I think, wargasm, that a climax of violence, you know, an outburst of violence would sweep away all of the bad things and allow the resurgence of a better society. And that has happened in so many countries, in so many different places. In the 20th century, enormously happened in the 20th century. I think our challenge now is to recognize that reform isn't enough. We need transformation, and we need that in order to avoid, I think the question is, can we avoid the catastrophe this time? Can we move to a different set of ways of organizing our society without having to go through the catastrophe that we went through in the Second World War? And obviously very good things came out of the Second World War in terms of the human rights legislation and European Union and things. but this time, can we avoid the catastrophe?
Very interesting question here. Can we avoid the catastrophe and come to a different sort of society in a 21st century of the what and why that we saw right now? From your perspective, Alyssa Jade McDonald-Buttle, what do you think from your perspective, also directly being in touch with the farmers and social businesses on the one hand, and also consulting businesses that want to become more social, and also by consulting politics and governments? What is your perspective about that?
When I hear the call for arms, literally from Nadav and Ian here, or the call for action, I wonder how we're going to do that. Nadav was talking about soldiers and the role of voting and putting our efforts, whether it's voting, protesting, or just sort of rising to or revolting to something that's going on. I wonder how we're going to do it. Who has experienced being sick sometime in the last weeks? Headache, a sore belly, not having enough energy, maybe COVID. When you're ill, do you function at your average? Go to work today, I'll just pick it up another day because maybe environment where we can have sick days. But I wonder where our soldiers are coming from when, for example, 500 million smallholder farmers who produce 80% of the food for the world are experiencing poor health and a lack of access to education. And I question this in this way. I'm with you in terms of the call for action, and I wonder how that can happen. Because if we all know what it's like to feel unwell in a day and not be able to turn up at our best, how can we imagine that for the world? For example, for every 1% of insufficient iron in our diet in our first 500 days of living, we have a 1% drop in cognitive ability. That means if we are born food insecure, we live cognitively challenged forever. How do we have the critical thinking that Nadav and Ian is calling on when we struggle to have that from the beginning? How do we galvanize when the multinational corporations who buy our products have a greater revenue than the gross domestic product of the country we live in? What sort of infrastructure surrounds us to enable us to both create an environment of living at our human's best? As Nadav opened and said, we live better than we did before in the past. Indeed, we do. I propose that we are not living to our capacity. And these soldiers that we are speaking of, there are 2 billion people in the world who live from the work of these 500 million smallholder farmers. How are we able to think critically? And as Ian says, come to a place of not wargasming all over the place, but thinking critically, thinking about the tools that we have and the structures we can put together. Sometimes they're legislative, sometimes they're economic, sometimes they're trade related. How are we doing that if we are chronically ill, not getting the access to education and capacity for critical thought that enables us to think about this within our communities? Are we then just going to revolt with violence, as Ian was talking about? Or, as Ian was also questioning, is there revolt in the form of reform, or is there revolt in the form of the orgasming? And I question, if we don't have the capacity, education, access to food, how are we expecting this to occur? Where is the tipping point? And I would love to hear from you gentlemen back.
Great, yeah, a great point here, and I'm super curious right now. And Eyal, you think you probably thought that I will ask you right now. What is your answer to that interesting question? I mean, if we don't have the capabilities, the capacity right now, but still we want to improve the lives for the many who don't have the food, who don't have the infrastructure, who don't have the governmental structure that we need. how can we still come to solutions? And I think, yeah, you have a broad mindset around it, and I'm super curious right now to hear your view about it.
So first, I need to say that Elisa Jade McDonald has a better perception of the troubles of small farmers than I do. Obviously, I think to a very large extent, it's a question of a south-north divide. And it's not only a question about farmers, in a sense, it's also a question about the people who make the stuff that are part of our lives. So farmers are really very critical, because we are mammals, and we either eat the flora or fauna, and that's what the way that we survive. There is no other way, right? We don't eat our smartphones, although sometimes they eat us. And I think that to a very, you know, an important way to look at it is to ask the questions of you know, how the materials arrived to this phone, and one of the answers, for instance, is that some of them were mined sometimes in Congo for columbite tantalite, or for other materials in mines that employ 5-year-olds and pay them 2 cents a day. And this is not, you know, some sort of an NGO publishing this. NGOs did publish it. There's sort of a Sky News piece, which I mentioned in my book, and they just traveled there with a camera, interviewed a young 5-year-old. So it's a south-north divide that we're talking about. It's global justice that we're talking about. And by justice, I don't mean the ideas of a sublime justice. I don't mean a reparation justice, although we can talk about that. I mean justice in the sense that that was just mentioned here, that people who supply us with food will have food security. So it's our interest. It's a very beneficial justice. It's a very practical justice. It's the sort of justice that you have in a society in which you want to have growth. Now, I want to respond to what Ian said about the difference between reform and transformative change. And look, some reforms, Ian, as you know, some reforms bring about a transformative change. Some do not. But it's not a matter of semantics. In a better world, I would be a conservative. In a better world, I was just born into this one, so I cannot afford to be a conservative, but I would want to. And by saying this is not just me being rhetorical. By saying this, what I mean is that I do not want the revolution. I do not want a real revolution, because I'm not using the word revolution the way that we use, you know, the green revolution. I'm using the word revolution for what it is historically. So when revolution, I spoke with people who saw revolutions. I'm not talking about, you know, the overthrow of the peaceful overthrow of the Eastern regimes, you know, the Eastern European regimes in the 1990s. I'm talking about real revolutions. For instance, the revolution in Iran in 1979, or the revolution, the October Revolution. Revolutions are a dirty business, and they include rivers of blood. And sort of the what you were saying about trying to prevent that, this is important. I would want these reforms to happen efficiently as we can now, because they are the right thing to do, and they're also the logical thing to do. And will they transform our societies? They probably will. Are we on the verge, I think, of violence? We're already there. We're already there. So when I first started writing, you know, the book back in Hebrew, I talk about the chances of the revolt turning into an uprising against progress. But we're seeing it right now. We're seeing it in the cities of Europe, you know, happening right now. And we're seeing charlatan, pseudoscience, anti-science, kind of conspiracy theories, far right, everyone, they're marching together, and you're seeing that almost physically sometimes, marching together. And they are the agents of chaos. And chaos is really something that civilization as a whole, not only Western civilization, but civilization as a whole, chaos is what it stands against. And in order to prevent that, we need this change to be immense, this reform to be meaningful. Will it be transformative? I'm not sure, and I'll sort of turn that back to you, Ian. What do you mean by saying transformative? What do you actually mean? I think that if we just do the bunch of reforms that right now the mainstream of the current system is saying, we're going to have a much better world. We're going to probably stop climate change in 40, 50 years. We're going to support, for instance, I just talked in Glasgow with the Climate and Environment Minister of Papua New Guinea. And he said to me, it's the last time I'm going to come to a COP because there's no use in coming. And I asked him why. And he said, because we're willing in Papua New Guinea to stop timber logging and to stop cutting down our rainforests. And we were talking about using the 100 billion fund that the industrial nations have agreed upon years and years ago in order to do that. And there's a price tag for these families that live on timber logging. And we know what's that price, and they know what's that price. And we're willing to declare all the rainforest in Papua New Guinea a complete nature reserve, and no tree would go down for commercial purposes anymore. But we know that it's just lagging and dragging. Now, just imagine, you know, Papua New Guinea holds, I think, 7% of the biodiversity in our world, and it's not such a big country. And just imagine what that would be. It would cost about $1 billion. $1 billion to declare all the rainforests in Papua nature reserves. Is this something that is beyond the horizon when you see a Jeff Bezos speech in Glasgow? I don't think it is. So I think these changes intertwine into a transformative change, which I'm looking for in order to prevent violence here. Do I believe we're gonna do that? I write in the end of the book, we should always remember the threat. The threat is not even climate change. It's not even biodiversity. The threat is another great war. And we have sort of forgotten that because most of us didn't see a great war. But another great war, possibly a final great war, that's always the threat of a world that can annihilate every living organism with weapons. And so I very much live with that, with your sentiment, Ian. But I'm just wondering what would be that transformative thing that you're talking about that you think that I'm not sort of pinpointing, that would be even better, larger, or more extensive than the reforms we already know that we need to do.
Super interesting question. I'm also curious here. So how can we make Nadav Eyal come again to Glasgow? And how can we make it that we go beyond our horizons in a transformative way? What does that mean from your perspective, Ian Hughes?
So I think it's the key question, Nadav, isn't it? Huh? In response, I think I would say there are 3 international treaties that I think, if they were implemented, would signal the transformation. So if the Sustainable Development Goals were implemented, if the Paris Agreement was implemented, if we were solving climate change, if we were solving global inequality, if the Ban Treaty on Nuclear Weapons was implemented and we had a nuclear-free world, then we would have a situation of transformation. But I don't think any of those things are going to happen without a transformation in the values upon which we base our societies. Yeah. So, and I don't think, so that's why in the project we're looking at, how do we reimagine these social institutions? Huh? Because it's not a simple case of individuals deciding, I want to be a nicer person. Huh? We're socially shaped. We're by the social institutions within which we're brought up. We're constrained every day in our lives in how we act by the social institutions that we're part of. So that's why we're saying we need to rethink the fundamental basis upon which all of these things are based. Yeah. So if you take for one, we're writing a paper on religion at the moment, and you may say this is so utopian, you know, but I think it's the real challenge of our time. Huh? So you could say any one of these social institutions has a mixture of both very positive elements and very toxic elements. Yeah. So if you look at religion, that very much holds sway. There's a lot of very positive and there's a lot of very toxic stuff in there. People in religious organizations and religious communities, to my mind, should be debating openly how they rid themselves of the toxic elements within religion. You know, sectarianism, you know, the idea that, you know, attitudes towards sexuality and sexual minorities, towards women and so forth. These communities should be, but all of this goes back in trying to reimagine all of these social institutions, maybe a gargantuan task, huh? But it goes back to what you have identified in your book. And again, this is a question back to you about, I think there are both constructive and destructive streams of revolt. And the challenge is, how do we empower the constructive element of that revolt? How do we empower these discussions and so on within all these social institutions, those forces that want to move these things towards more humane, more caring, more loving basis on which we can order our society. Yeah? And that's also, you know, the book I've written, Disordered Minds, about particular personality disorders. I think it's crucial. They're a minority in society, but I think they have an enormous impact because they keep getting to positions of power where they can shape these social institutions. So, as I say, it's a gargantuan task. We have the roadmaps, if you like, in those 3 treaties that I mentioned at the beginning, agreed internationally, but I don't see us getting there in any very simple way. We need to, so I guess my question to you, you know, in your research and so forth, do you see this constructive and destructive? And are there ways of empowering that constructive stream of revolt?
Thank you very much. And just before answering to that, I want to mention again, in a few minutes, we will turn to the audience questions. So we have some questions in the chat already. Nonetheless, you have the chance still to post some questions in. Now's your chance to do it, because later on we will collect it, and we will also collect, of course, what's in them at the moment that we look at it. First Nadav and Yal, and then Alyssa Jade McDonald-Birtle. I would be very interested in your answer to the question of Ian Hughes right now. The constructive and the destructive forces, they both exist, and the destructive forces, sometimes they are not that numerous, nonetheless they are super powerful. And how can we empower the constructive forces? Because that's also, I believe, the key to sustainable change. Potentially Nadav Eyal, because the question was raised by Ian Hughes directly to you. Maybe you want to answer directly in the first round.
Yeah, well, of course, I deal with it extensively in the book. So I talk with fascists, neo-Nazis, racists, anti-Semites. This is what I do. I'm a journalist. This is what I did as part of my day job. But these conversations are more in depth, and the reason that they're more in depth is because I sort of thought, when I started conversing with them, which was more than 10 years ago, much more than 10 years ago. I don't want to even say when it started, when it began, but I thought that they. Right after the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, or during the financial crisis, I lived in London, so I saw the city sort of tripling, and I saw how capitalism was changing and was threatened. And I saw that these people are going to have a field day, so I started meeting them back then, and they are within this revolt, they are definitely rebels, So the revolt is a dialectical process. I remember reading something in Amnesty about my book, and they were really offended that I would say that the revolt has, you know, a face of a fascist, and sometimes it has a face of a climate activist. Now, I'm on the side of the climate activists, but they were offended by me even sort of mentioning this thing. But that's not the point. It's not a normative stance. It's understanding that something's not working, or not even understanding, but sort of employing the sentiment that it's not working. Power structures are not working anymore. They're not working. So it's just preposterous that in the age of, you know, smartphones and mobile phones, defund the police. When I wrote that, that was before George Floyd was murdered, and before these demonstrations took place saying defund the police. Now, I don't think that defunding the police is such a, you know, bright idea. I don't know, but I don't think so. But anyway, I like the slogan, the reason I liked it is because it was thoughtful, as you said earlier, Ian, about the social institutions that we have. Are they suitable? Are they there? Do they do what they need to do? So yeah, this is, you know, this is what it means. In a situation of revolt, those who are in the process first, and those who might be yelling stronger, and those who were already represented, they might take the advantage. And that's the problem with that sentiment. So in one piece I write about this is that the reason I'm very worried about the far right is because the far right has already been in power. It's already been there. Now, whether we were there to witness it or we would not, it's not important. But they have the way, institutional way to be there. And if we look at the far left has almost never managed to gain power through democracy or through open elections. And there is a reason that the October Revolution was basically a coup d'etat made by the Bolsheviks, which turned into a full-scale revolution. But it did not begin, you know, that way. So I'm very worried about these parts of the revolt, and even, you know, the way that they will be used for shock therapy, as Naomi Klein sort of observes, by these corporations. And I think that a good way to differentiate is through humanistic values. Are these people that are preaching to me right now, do they hold the human entity as the most higher thing in their ladder of principles, maybe together with God? You know, religious people can be humanistic, or they do not? Is it the state? Is it ethnic? Is it religious? So it's a way to differentiate, you know, if you would want enlightened and less enlightened ways of revolt. But without understanding that it's a sentiment kind of thing, it's a horseshoe kind of thing, you know, and there's a closeness between extremes. If we don't understand that, we'll have, you know, trouble navigating and harnessing the power of the revolt. And the power is there. So the power is there. People are willing, young people are willing to go out there, and they're willing to do things. But they're not going to do that for Emmanuel Macron. I don't want to insult anyone. Right. So if that's your point here, you know, Macron understood, you know, he understood basically the right things, but no, they're not going to fight for Emmanuel Macron's of the world. That's the truth, right? So he's not going to harness the power of revolt. He's just going to be a big target for the revolt. And that's what he is right now, right? So, and then you get, you know, the kind of people who are running against him in France right now. We had Marine Le Pen, which I met, and I quoted the book. But right now we're having things which are worse than Marine Le Pen. We're going to have things that are worse than Donald Trump. Okay, so Donald Trump is just the beginning. He didn't have, you know, he didn't make his own homework. Just imagine that we'll have a Donald Trump that actually made some of his own homework one day of his life. Then we're in deep trouble.
Super interesting. Thank you so much, Nada Vial. And right now, Alyssa Jade McDonald-Battle, I'm very interested about your view on how can we empower the constructive forces? How can we make, as Nada Vial right said, the young people get up on the street for humanistic values? How can we make that voice of sentiment louder in a sense of sustainable progress of government, state, and also the families living locally and the social businesses acting locally and globally? What's your perspective on that?
Discussion. Empowering the constructive revolt. I know one of the questions here was also about the role of economics, and I love Nadal, the amount of pledges coming out of Glasgow and the amount, let's say, climate positive financing. And I really love that you mentioned Papua New Guinea, because that's where my family come from. Indeed, are struggling with these things. And this is where I pick up the point. The money is on the table, yet in my daily experience, I observe old-fashioned ways of managing that money that's not conducive to how it's necessarily needed. What I want to say here is the enabling or empowering constructive revolt should put on the money for these sorts of things. I sit on a variety of organizations that receive over $1 billion a year developmental funding. The conditions are that this post-it, this pen, and all sorts of teeny tiny aspects of the funding end up having to be reported into how is that money being spent? Is it spent in the donor being spent, or spending it with your infinite wisdom around cultural conditions of Papua New Guinea? What I want to say is money table, we're all celebrating it and saying it great. I think we need to question more questions being put on that money. Is that money going to the best on the, and are we just upholding old colonial conditions on that money, a new form, and calling it a different? It is hard to access mental global south. That's my daily job, and it's very, very difficult. These old questions of how much money did you spend on? The second question, going back to Ian's point, efficiency of our social institutions, I think it is as difficult in the global north regarding, let's say, the funding for NGOs and social enterprise, who also have conditions that are difficult to achieve their goals. In the global north, you're also required to have co-financing volumes. Where and how is an NGO or a startup social enterprise going to get their basic co-financing when they're still on developing this idea? They're competing against an old economic model as an established market player. So my question here is both economics aspect as well as, let's say, the global south version, both experience troubles. There is funding available on them, not empowering the good that they have to do. I think, as per Ian's question, how I think a good place to be looking at what is the conditions of this money, how is it necessarily financed, what are the incentives to venture capital, and how are we measuring success?
How do we measure success? What an interesting last point from here, Alyssa Jade McDonald, and also to bring in the point of how do we use our money? Where is it going? And are we really aware of it? Where our smartphones and things alike are coming from, what the raw materials come from, how it is produced. Very rarely we think about it in that depth. And we, oftentimes are very optimistic about buying new things and so on, but we don't think further at some point, and maybe we can contribute to thinking further in that group. Thank you very much for that super interesting discussion. And right now I received a message from Markus Glatz-Schmalegger that we have some questions in the chat that we promised to answer. I will just have a look what the first questions were here from Martina. Let me have a look. What the first one was. Excellent presentation. Okay, so that was a compliment to you at first. Can
I ask a question while you scan the questions from the chat, maybe?
A short one, so that we have the time for the audience question.
Yes, I mean, to you as a scientist and to Nadav as a narrator, are we using the term of system failure too easily? Because I'm wondering, isn't the system doing exactly what it was designed for? Isn't a failure if something unexpected happens and not only if something undesirable happens? So the point is the system delivers very well on what it is designed for to the people who designed it. And only now are we getting to a point where Nadav argues rightfully, I think, that we're stretching it in a way that we're biting the hand that feeds us and we're putting at risk the very foundation. But it has delivered what it was intended to deliver to those who designed it. So is it a system failure?
So, yeah, exactly. To whom of the three would you preferably ask the question?
Whoever wants to pick it up. So is it a bad design or a system failure?
So who of you is the one who says, I want to speak first? No one, so
yeah,
Ian is coming.
Yes, I have a question to the Nadav Yal. Is all you know, Excellency. He is.
Maybe
I first of all.
Yeah, Abdus, could we just wait for 2 seconds, because I think Ian, you just wanted to answer the question from Ernst, and I recognize that you are the first in the row for the question because you asked all the time, can I interrupt? And,
okay.
But I noted you're the first, no worries.
So, thanks, Ernst. I guess I'm not going to have a very comprehensive answer for you, but I guess the system hasn't been designed, you know, consciously. You know, it's not someone standing back and designing. So, but in that sense, I think my answer would be that it has had too much. There has been too much power and control in individuals, or in, well, the values, the framework of values is such that it prioritizes individuals who see, you know, individual narcissism as being the purpose of the system, you know, are benefiting from that. And so the system is clearly failing. Multiple systems are clearly failing, but they're working for a minority. I don't think they're working for the majority, and they're certainly not working in terms of the, you know, sustainability and social cohesion.
Thank you very much. Yeah, right now, Abdus Dula, right now it's your chance to jump in with your question.
Is already in my chat box. I already given, but what I said that of course we are in now globalization, but my question is, society and actions are not resilience at this moment, especially till now. It is not appropriate for the disabled people, and they are out from the participation, engagement in development, and they are struggling also to contribute in this world. So without 1 billion disabled person, how world move? This is my question. And we disabled person not want to maintain our life by dependent on anyone or any institution or any so-called rehabilitation institution. We love to be a citizen of the nation, and we love to contribute through the national different action, including the political system.
So it's a statement that that you
no,
just
this is
my
I asking that, you know, this without 1 billion visible person, how world is moved, you know, this is more than 1 billion visible people. Our society, our world, our politics, our democracy, our voting system, our professionalism, our ethics, our role and responsibility, when not humanistic way, is moving right now. Even in 21 century, leadership, what we see is not really realize the problem of the world, you know, and there is a lot of interest conflict also, nation to nation and the people to people, and the most of the, you know, minority people, like visible people, are left out from the everything in the, I want to say, in terms of status, in terms of dignity, in terms of equality, you know, in terms of, you know, economic values even, you know. So that's my point too. And it is for, I think is better for the Nadev and anyone maybe answer.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nadev. Yeah, what do you see? Say, how can we bring the people that are currently not in powerful positions therein? What's your view?
If I understood the question correctly, the answer is politics. Politics is a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing, but there's no way around it. And one of the problems that we're having is that on one hand, we're seeing young people want to be very much involved, but they just don't want to be involved in politics specifically. And what I'm saying is not my intuition, is that this is how polls look like. So they're willing to be active, not all of them, but some of them are willing to be active, sometimes more than my generation, okay? But they don't want to go into politics at all. And politics is our best shot in making a change that would be quick enough, not as deep as we need. So if we want a deep change, and what we really need is a deep change, whether we call it transformative or extensive reform, but we need a deep change, for instance, in our consumer behavior, for instance. And I'm touching what Elisa Jade McDonald has said. So if we need that deep change, it won't stem from politics, but politics can deliver on tools for that. And if we need sort of band-aid emergency change, that's our best shot. That's our best shot. And in order to have that politics, it's about organization, it's about leveraging power, it's about power, basically. It's about power. So it's not about anything romantic. It's about how, you know, power and how you gain it. And that doesn't mean, you know, necessarily becoming a Machiavelli. But it does mean that you need to be focused on, I think, on this idea. You know, good people in the end, in positions of power, do, generally speaking, better things than people that face value, you know, are not exactly as good as you would say in your own normative judgment. Or in other words, if you put people that are basically good in good positions, that do basically good stuff, and if you put, you know, people that are not good there, that do other things, and sometimes you don't need to agree with everything they say, and they don't need to be perfect, but you need to put them, and everything would be slightly or extensively better. And I think a good example is President Biden, which is a completely mainstreamist, you know, politician that has been on board every kind of energy company. I don't know, you know, but can he bring about a change? He can. Did President Johnson bring a change with the Civil Rights Bill in the 1960s? He did. Was he, you know, a mainstream politician coming from the Deep South? He was. So it's possible in politics.
you very much, Nadav. Yeah, we have another question here, and thank you also.
1 second, Miriam.
Pardon?
Excuse me, Miriam. May I also just contribute here? I
Yeah,
thought it was a great question, and Nadav's nudge regarding the role of involving in politics is one aspect, and I'd like to also propose the idea of investing in social innovation in another. What I heard from Abdus was specifically around a certain target group that experience, for example, physical disability. And what I question here is, in the past, we've often relied on welfare state and, let's say, taking care of people or putting structures in place for people, but not necessarily thinking about frameworks, investment conditions, creating networks between individuals that experience something to create their own social innovation going forward. I think there's some really interesting models around social innovation. We see things like social enterprises, and we see things like NGOs that have commercial models also behind them. There is something in here about these sorts of organizations participating at a greater level. And I would just be curious, or would like to put in the thought there, is that how we invest and foster social innovation, what our expectations of old welfare state thinking is, and what new models, especially inspired by technology, can do. There's phenomenal work about just creating networks and people in peer-based learning, cohort and peer-based co-creation. There are things in there that I think could well speak to Abdus's question in terms of how can we get this point forward. And I would say that the creation from the target group itself, leveraging some contemporary models in the face of old welfare state thinking, could be a contribution to think of.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. Yeah, super good contribution.
Miriam, could I just very briefly?
Okay, I mean, after Dulal, you get right now 3 answers, maybe relatively short so that we can tackle the further questions. But of course, yeah, just go ahead. I'm interested about your view, and I guess Abdus Dulal too.
I can be very short, but I think this is at the core of the discussion we've been having about integrate or revolt. Because I think it is about new ways of participation, whether it's people with disability or women or sexual minorities or ethnic groups and so on. But that new ways of participation has to also be open to changing the system. It's not simply a matter of those participants submitting to the existing rules and norms and so on.
That was very fast. Thank you very much. And thank you, Abdus Dulal, once again. Now we have Martina Fern, who's asking, I am curious to hear what Nadav Eyal thinks about Steven Pinker's recent books, in which he stresses the general improvement of the human condition, but for which he has been criticized for not addressing the remaining and growing inequities. What do you think about leaving out the remaining and growing inequities? Nadav Eyal.
So first of all, I need to say that if we're talking about global inequality has been shrinking since the 1970s extensively between people from different countries. It has been growing within the West, right, within Western capitalism. But people are being empowered in the end, and more than 1 billion people, managed to escape poverty, and they didn't just escape it. They worked, they toiled for that. They worked very hard to do that within the system, and this is the most important thing historically that has happened in our lifetimes. But as we go along with that, I think that people feel more severely the inequities that you see today within societies, both global South and global North, and they expect more. They expect more of their systems, of their social systems, and we know how protests can change that. And I'll just give an example from my country. 10 years ago, Israelis went and had the largest mass social protests on economy, basically, in their history, at one point, I think there was about 8% of the citizens on the streets physically. So this was really very widespread protests. We're talking about hundreds of thousands in a country of less than 10 million people that were there. And as a result, inequality in my country dropped in the last 10 years. And that's because of reforms by the government relating to education and so forth. And I think this is important to understand that we can change these things, and we change them through pressuring people in power structures to do so. And I think we're seeing this change, and we need the change not to stop, but it is stopping because of climate change, for instance. So Bangladesh managed to pull itself to a large extent. Now it's suffering because of climate change. We're going to see more people hungry, not only food insecure, but hungry. And if we're not going to tackle this right now, then people are going to be much more angrier, relating to what Ian said, because you're going to take things from them they already have. And it's different than not granting them things that they never had before. This thing leads to violence.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm looking to the round and don't see from Alyssa, Jade, McDonald, Butler, Ian, huge reaction. So I move forward with the chat. Thank you so much for the moment. Damian S. Purkosh, I hope I spell it correctly. He states voters are the solution in political sphere only. In economic, we need buyers and customers who press for the change. It's the market-generated greed that has undermined the core values of our societies and keeps us away from sustainability. Very interesting thoughts here, I would say, and I look into the round whether someone of the speakers would want to make a contribution of it, because it's no question directly, but nonetheless, giving you the chance, if you want to react, you maybe, Lisa Jade McDonald Battle would want to react on this. Yeah, just go ahead.
Thank you, Damien, for your input. I would say that the expectations put on companies, the way they are measured, the way they are funded, the way they are pushed forward is indeed something that creates greed. I would also say that market actors are sometimes the inefficiency between a technical innovation being produced and it reaching good. So it can both be an actor of evil as well as an actor for good. Very specifically in agriculture, my favorite topic, we see this at play at once. We see exactly the mass pressing of subsistence farmers and environmental protection for the purpose of crop and volume. At the same time, we see these same market actors as potentially being partners in delivering education, remote healthcare, and other economic opportunities in communities. It's only what are we actually stimulating? How are we rewarding these sorts of organizations? And I really question, it would be a very big problem in rural and remote food communities for suddenly multinationals to disappear. You know, sometimes I get people asking me, should we just stop eating chocolate tomorrow? On one side, yes, you should reduce the amount of chocolate, for example, that we eat tomorrow, because it is creating an unsustainable pressure on our food system. On the other side, these organizations have deep and extensive roots in communities that if suddenly tomorrow they turned off, I predict that will create a greater problem than if they were just adjusted. So what I think we need to keep in mind is when we look at companies and commercial behavior, especially in developing environments, it is rather the question of what can be tweaked as opposed to stagnantly stopping something.
Thank you very much. I'm happy that we don't need to stop eating chocolate, so we can be happy with chocolate still. And I see Ian Hughes raises the hand, maybe because I see there are more things coming in. I just read through the chat and maybe you note down the things that you want to mention to the post so that we can make then a round of you through three as closing words to all of the chats that are coming in. Peter Odrakiewicz says, if governments and transnational corporations would do what they preach, even a 20 to 40% range, change would start to happen. The issues raised here by you are very important to humanity, survival. Thank you for the great presentations and scientific high quality input. Yeah, thank you to your remark. I think, yeah, that's nice to hear here. Network. Aha, okay. A question from the Austria chapter, Markus Schmallegger, is that you could maybe think in your final statement about what you want to give us as an order as the Humanistic Management Network, because we are global people here at the desk, and maybe you have something in your mind. What can we do? Then Maximilian Sauerzopf says, I think a revolution is never the answer. The key is education and persuade people by arguments. So better evolution instead of revolution. Peter Odrakiewicz is very active here. He says some governments that are too much oil and coal dependent are not taking even part in those discussions. In co-op or similar forums, representatives and trying to water down all agreements. I say this without mentioning their names here due to the scientific nature and academic inquiry going here. Difficult change such as decarbonization. Oh, now it's very long. I think Nadav Eyal, I shorten it up a little bit. He says, Nadav, Alyssa, and Ian and Miriam, thank you for your great contribution. I will share your expertise with my students. Thank you very much. That's very nice. You will have also the recording in a few instants. Right now, what else is here in the chat? Everyone's muted. Yeah, okay, here was a chat to me. I would like to contribute. Okay, I think we tackled that. Alyssa Jade McDonald-Bethel. And another comment by Peter Odrakiewicz. I think we will circle around the chat afterwards. I just will have a look whether we have a question still from another person that did not have the chance to contribute. No, but we have 3 minutes left, so I would invite you, 1 minute each of you, maybe this time starting with Alyssa Jade McDonald, you were the last before, to have some final words to the round here.
Great, thank you very much. I heard from you and Marcus a request for a call to action, and this would be mine, and that is please consider what you're funding. And not necessarily as an individual, I think we all find it quite relatively easy to make choices as individuals at the moment, especially for those of us who've turned up to join this sort of a discussion. Please think about what you're funding via your work and your jobs. Where is your money being invested? Who are you buying from? All the tiny things around us. I think these are the places we have to look first. And you know, a really simple way to do it is to look at our tax statements at the end of the year, pick the top 5 areas, top 5 places we're really spending our money. And let's look at those. Is it our heating? Is it the rent for our organizations? Is it our people that are working with us? Please follow the money for the first big places where you can make a direct and meaningful change. It will, in the end, lead to many of the things that we talked about today, but it has to start with us looking at where the big ticket items are and making the change there. We call that supply chain transparency these days. We call that responsibility, but in the end, for many of us that don't know where to start, beyond just having meat-free Mondays and being a nice person, let's take that next step. Pay it with your money. Where are the top 5 areas you're spending? And please kindly consider and look behind, where is that money going? Because this is a tipping point when we all on the call did that at once.
Thank you very much. Maybe briefly, shortly, a stopping point, because we're almost reaching the end. Yeah, Ian, Nadav, you were the first right now. Then Ian Hughes, we take you as a second speaker, and Nadav as the closing words. Ian, would you mind just 2-3 closing words to the round here?
Okay, I guess just to respond to Marcus's call for action now. I was struck by a comment by Commissioner Gabriel of the European Commission about innovation, and that, you know, with the degree of innovation that's now needed, the substitution of fossil fuel technology entirely with renewable technology and so forth, that we live in an age of innovation, and that innovation should be at the core of economics. And so I would say the call for the Humanistic Management Network is to lead the charge for rethinking innovation. That includes the type of things that Elisa has been talking about. I love the idea of a goat being an innovation. That innovation just isn't about the products. It isn't just about innovating for new products. It's innovation that also changes deeply the context within which innovation is happening. So that's my call to the network.
Thank you very much to you. Nadav, closing words for our session here. What would you want to give us here?
I think, first of all, it was an immensely fruitful discussion for me, and I thought about things that I didn't think about before, which is really important. It's because of the things that Elisa and Ian talked about, and sort of both the advantages of for social institutions, and I'm taking your advice about seeing, where our money goes, Elisa. So I think this was very important for me. If we look at what we need to focus on right now, we need to focus, I think, on creating, harboring, giving birth to a story that can lead people into actual change, and not focus so much on planning the radical change that we want to happen in the world. Because first of all, we basically know what it is. And secondly, that's not our obstacle here. Our obstacle is really convincing people. And when you understand that it's not about being right all the time. It's not about being just. It's not being spot on. It's not about hitting the target with 100%. It's about gaining enough for 70, 75%. Then you start to be focusing on real change, and not only on just being in your echo chamber in which everybody agrees with you. And I think this is right now the most important thing. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today, sort of here.
I want to thank you very much. And I want to also say it with the words of Martina Fern, such a great discussion. Thank you very much, you three. That was super interesting to have the broad variety of perspectives brought in a super high quality. I'm very honored to have had the chance to moderate you, and we are 3 minutes over. Ernst von Kimakowitz, I hope that's not too bad. I think we learned a lot, and we will take your perspectives with us. And without further say, we saw the agenda for the next slots beforehand. Due to the time, I won't bring it up again, but want to very, very highly thank you again and close just like that. Thank you very much. And I hand over to you again, Ernst von Kimakowitz.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And yes, you are 3 minutes late, but I only wish we would have had 3 hours more to continue this discussion. It was